and I made that promise that I would do so. But this being 2017, the hell with that promise. Oh, excuse me. I'm going to read this as well as I can. Let's see what happens. If you were at the previous Peace Corps Story Slam held at Rudyard's last year, you might remember my story, Welcome to India. This evening I have another of my Peace Corps adventures into public health in India that took place in the mid-20th century. But before I get into all the details of my story, I need to give you a bit of background into the mission of my Peace Corps group, India 20A. That means by 1965, we were the 20th group to go to India. Our specialty was rural public health. In India in 1965, tuberculosis, malaria, cholera, smallpox, and plague were killing with deadly efficiency. However, the population was still increasing, since children served as a kind of homemade social security plan. In response, the Indian government had asked the Peace Corps for help with providing technical assistance in the areas of health education, environmental sanitation, control of communicable diseases, and family planning. Within the area of family planning, we were taught how condoms are used. Remember, this was 1965, and how they could be reused. Bananas were used for illustrative purposes. We were also taught about lippus loops, also known as intrauterine devices, or IUDs, and which were commonly used by women from the 1960s through the 1980s, worldwide, as a birth control method. We received a reasonable amount of training in that area, of course, without the benefit of illustrations or photos. Remember, 1965. The other method of birth control we received some information about was the vasectomy. A vasectomy is a permanent method of birth control and applies only to men. That is because the vas deferens, which is a narrow muscular tube that connects the testicles, is clamped, cut, or otherwise sealed. Doing that prevents sperm from mixing with the semen that is ejaculated from the well. I'm sure you get the idea. Once again, this being 1965, we did not really get specific, illustrated, detailed, hands-on training in the performance of the vasectomies. Fast forward to our arrival in the state of Kerala in India. We were working in teams of 4. In my case, I worked with Essie, David, and Gay. During our first weeks in Kerala, we got to know the physician who worked in the rural public health center to which we were assigned, and the people who lived in the village in which we were provided the small house. We also purchased and wore Indian clothing so we would not stand out too much. How well do you think that worked? In addition, we bought and used Indian toiletries. For instance, I tried Indian razor blades, but soon found that they were not very sharp. In fact, to complete shaving, I had to use from 2 to 3 new blades, one after another. I finally gave up on using them as shaving was bordering on torture. Of course, we had to get used to the weather. It was usually hot, but the unique thing was the humidity. Combined with the temperature, it could make one very uncomfortable. To illustrate, a July hot and humid day in Houston would be considered a spring-like day in Kerala. As fate would have it, Dr. T.A. Pillai, the physician in charge of the Rural Public Health Center to which we were assigned, and knowing that part of our duties concerned family planning, invited us to attend a vasectomy that he would be performing in the center's operating room. In 1966 in rural India, the phrase operating room was more of a concept than an accurate description. Yes, there was a room and there was an operating table, but the table was old, dented, and tarnished. There were also 2 or 3 windows without glass or screens in the whitewashed operating room. This, of course, allowed the flies to come and go as they pleased. Fortunately, one of Dr. Pillai's assistants had the task of swatting away those flies, thus helping to maintain sanitary conditions and providing the assistant lifetime job security. At the appointed time, the four of us filed into the operating room. 3 22-year-olds and Essie, an older woman who had reached the advanced age of 27. Lying on the operating table was a man at least in his 50s. Any male receiving a vasectomy at that time received a payment of 50 rupees. That was big money at that time. Nearby was Dr. Pillai's assistant casually brushing the flies away while waiting for Dr. Pillai to arrive. The operating room was quite hot and humid. In fact, I was beginning to feel a bit clammy as it occurred to me that this would be the first time I had ever seen an operation of any type. Dr. Pillai entered the operating room looking confident. On the other hand, the patient looked a little concerned. Dr. Pillai gave us some brief commentary and began to work. The assistant lifted the patient's munda, a kind of wrap that Kerala men wore in those days, and exposed him to anybody who happened to be looking at the time. The assistant brushed aside the flies. At this point, I noticed that the operating room walls were apparently not as well constructed as I had first thought, since I couldn't help but to observe that they were beginning to move. Not too much, of course, but enough to be noticeable. At any rate, Dr. Pillai had the assistant apply a local anesthetic to the area to be cut. Now, gentlemen, we are all familiar with that area, and married ladies, I am sure that many of you are also familiar with it. It is not an area that most men would want to have anesthetized. I mean, it is one thing to have a tooth anesthetized, but to have one's, okay, I'll just say it, scrotum deadened is a bit much. By this time, our patient was not looking too happy. As for me, I began to wonder how Dr. Pillai was going to successfully complete this operation, because by this time, the floor of the operating room was beginning to undulate, making it difficult for me to stand. Dr. Pillai tapped the patient's testicles a few times to make certain that the operation could proceed without pain. Then he stated that the operation would begin. By now, I thought things were getting a bit dicey, as the floor and the walls were increasing their movement, and the assistant seemed to be at the losing end of the battle with the flies. However, Dr. Pillai had the situation in hand and located the patient's vas deferens within the testicles. Upon locating said vas deferens, Dr. Pillai selected a scalpel and began to make an incision. For some reason, the scalpel was not working too well, and I noticed that Dr. Pillai had to saw back and forth to cut the skin to reach the vas deferens. In the meantime, the patient's legs started to shake. At this moment, I noticed that the operating room was emulating a ship on a rolling sea, making it difficult for me to focus. However, despite that, my mind focused enough to enable me to notice something that I had somehow missed when Dr. Pillai had begun to cut, or saw, as seemed to be the case. Remember when I mentioned how difficult it was for me to shave with an Indian razor blade, and that it took around 3 blades to get me through one shave? Well, I realized that actually Dr. Pillai was not using a scalpel to cut the patient's you-know-what. It was a razor blade, and that was no Gillette Blue Blade. It was an Indian razor blade. That was why Dr. Pillai had to saw back and forth to reach the patient's vas deferens. How Dr. Pillai, his assistant, and my 3 PCV teammates could keep standing with the room now bouncing like a small boat on a rolling sea, I had no idea. It then dawned on me that the room was not really moving. Rather, I was about to keel over. After the operation was completed, Essie, Gay, and Dave found me staring into space on a bench located outside the operating room. How I got there to this day, I have no idea. But at least that bench was not moving as much as the operating theater. My teammates were very solicitous of me and stayed with me until I could walk and talk again. So that was a story of my first vasectomy and the basic reason that I did not apply to medical school after becoming a returned Peace Corps volunteer.